Cavenaugh.
Well, thank you, Joseph, for that introduction. I will say welcome to everyone who is here, and thank you for being here under these unusual circumstances and for joining us. I will reiterate a couple of things that Joseph mentioned. I am a Unitarian myself. My wife and I joined the Unitarian Church in 2003 in Baton Rouge. And so it is great to be able to speak with other Unitarians and to share, speak with people that I share values with and interests and concerns with. I'm also a communication professor who sort of stumbled into issues of diversity and inclusion. My actual research background is on ritual and spirituality and performance. And yet when I first came to Rollins College, I was asked to teach intercultural communication and started enjoying teaching how to communicate across cultural boundaries and got well known for being able to do that. And that led to me being asked to be one of the founding members of Safe Zone in 2007, and that led to more and more diversity and inclusion work, culminating eventually in 2015 with me being a co-chair of the Diversity Council at Rollins. So it's been an ongoing journey for me, learning about issues of diversity and inclusion and social justice, and trying to find my place within that conversation. And it's a journey that I've taken in part because of the beliefs that I've developed and strengthened as a member of the Unitarian Universalist Church. So with that in mind, I'm going to go into share mode now because you don't need to sit and watch me sitting in my sister-in-law's spare bedroom. It's going to be up, but the host is disabled share. Can you enable share, Amy, for me? Because I can talk without sharing what I'm seeing on the screen, but I think it will work better if I can share it.
Just one sec. I'm trying to find it.
The joys of technology, how much easier it makes all our lives. Enjoy, folks. As she's working on that,
okay,
there we go, yay!
Okay, I tried to make you a co-host earlier and it didn't let me, so that's how I needed to do it.
All right. So problem solved, crisis averted. And yeah, I'm a 21st century professor, so of course I have PowerPoint. The main reason I'm using it now, of course, is that it gives you something else to look at besides my face, and also is a useful way of anyone who wants to review the ideas or rethink the ideas. I'm going to be sending the actual file that I'm using here to Amy, and y'all can hold on to that. So the topic that I wanted to address is the challenge of becoming welcoming, in particular what makes for a useful ally. And the reason I want to do this is for several things. First off, y'all are already a welcoming congregation. You have the little symbol on your website that indicates that you've taken the steps that the Unitarian Church requires to be officially declared a welcoming congregation. So it's not that you don't want to do this or don't consider this important to you. So I don't need to explain why it's important to you. What I do want everybody to think about, given my own background, is how allies can support members of the LGBTQ+ community. I've also chosen the topic of being a good ally in part because it's a bigger issue than addressing the LGBTQ+ community. In addition to COVID-19, in addition to all the other things we're dealing with, this is a singular moment in American history in terms of questions of marginalized communities, how those marginalized communities are responded to, valued, have voice, find voice, take action, and obviously, marginalized communities are generally in the numerical minority, and so allies can assist these marginalized communities in finding solutions and addressing problems. And then the question is, how can you be a useful ally for any member of a marginalized community? So the first question I want to ask everybody, and all my questions now I need to know oracle. I say that because at the end of the talk, I'll be creating space for folks to ask questions or make comments. But the first question I want to ask Unitarian Universalists is it enough to fly the pride flag? Certainly having that flag and that symbol at your worship center, at your on your website, in your neighborhood. That's really important. I know that my wife and I just recently moved, and one of the things that made us think that we wanted to move to the community that we ended up moving to was the presence of multiple pride flags. So we're like, okay, we feel comfortable here. But oftentimes, the outward show that you are in support of this community or are a member of these communities may not be enough to fulfill what Joseph mentioned at the beginning of this service, which is our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equality, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another, and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of democratic process within our congregation and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. This is true of your congregation and of all other Unitarian Universalist congregations. And obviously, to accomplish those 7 principles, to put those principles into practice, involves more than just sort of saying, yay, go team, or we like you. It involves taking active steps to provide support for and engagement with these communities. And to create voice for members within these communities. So I want to share a little bit about my perspective as an ally. And this is a picture of me a few pounds ago, yay, for COVID-19 giving me a reason to start exercising, and also before I grew the beard and mustache back. But this is me accepting the award for diversity and inclusion on the Rollins campus. Main reason I show that is to make sure you know the following. When you think of privilege and the elements of privilege that the identity elements that grant privilege in the United States, some identity elements that historically are historically privileged in US culture are being white, being male, being heterosexual, being cisgender, being upper class, and being well educated. And I am all of those things. And I am an ally and advocate for diversity and inclusion. But I come to that perspective, if I'm being honest with myself and with the folks that I am an ally for, as well as my fellow allies. If I'm honest with people, I have to acknowledge I have just about every privileged background there is. I have in many cases sidestepped or avoided a lot of the challenges that folks who are not in these categories on the screen face on a daily basis. And so if I'm going to be honest and mindful about my position, I have to recognize that I am a privileged ally and ask myself what my role is as a privileged ally. One way of putting this is basically I have no business telling anyone about diversity and inclusion, not really. But I have to remind myself on a fairly regular basis that I'm never going to be an expert on marginalized communities in the sense that I'm never going to be a member of a marginalized community, at least unless US culture changes dramatically as we move forward in ways that I would appreciate, by the way. So what I can offer as a member of all these privileged communities is some suggestions for those who want to be a good ally. Now, before I go any further, I'm well aware that there are some critiques of folks who are going out into the world as privileged identities saying, let's help the allies be better allies. And one of those critiques is, why are you focusing on the allies and not on the people who actually need the help? One example of this is there have been some critiques of the book White Fragility, which is a bestseller now on Amazon as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement. And those critiques have focused on why should we be concerned about how fragile whites are? Why shouldn't we be concerned about the challenges being faced by people of color in the United States instead of wringing our hands over whether white people can handle the challenge of being allies for people of color. Nonetheless, if you are an ally, being a good ally is a real challenge. And that's what I was trying to frame in my introductory words that Joseph shared with you earlier. If you are an ally, how do you do it well so that you can support the real work that has to go on within these communities and around these communities? Let me quickly note that being a good ally is, in my mind, the basement floor of activism with regard to marginalized groups. This is the minimum of what is to be expected. It's less a heroic standing against the tide and more of, well, not making things worse and maybe making things a little better by being self-aware. As the ground floor of activism and social justice pursuits, being a good ally will enable other larger actions and make those actions possible. And of course, being an ally can run the spectrum from expressing support for the community in quiet but clear ways on the one hand, up to and beyond marching in support of LGBTQ+ rights. So allies run a spectrum. Regardless, when you are an ally, allies should ideally, I would argue, empower marginalized community members to find and implement their solutions from within the marginalized community. This is a key point of my talk, that oftentimes privileged speakers in good conscience and with good intentions end up being the ones whose voices are heard when we have issues about marginalized communities and when the folks from the marginalized communities can and should be the ones whose voices are heard. There is, of course, an irony in that I am replicating that right now. But I'm also hopefully exploring how to be a better ally so that other voices can be heard and shared. So what is the ally experience, whether you're a heterosexual ally, heterosexual cisgender ally for the LGBTQ+ communities, or a white ally for communities of color, etc.? What does it mean to be an ally? Well, long-term allies of marginalized communities know the following. One, you will always be behind the curve. You'll always be trying to figure out how things work and what you didn't understand about this community. Two, the rest of the world will always be even further behind than you. You'll always have to be educating others around you. Three, your experience of the world is your experience as a member of a privileged community. Their experience, the experience of the marginalized community members, is theirs, and you have to keep those separate. Sometimes, finally, sometimes it's best just to stay put, shut up, and listen. Maybe as much as we get fired up and want to do things, maybe first we need to listen to the people within these communities to hear what they have to say about what we should or could be doing to help them. So the first of these points is that you will always be behind the curve. And this can be disheartening for allies because most allies go into the experience earnestly hoping that they can be of benefit to these communities. Often you're motivated by a connection to a friend, a family member, a coworker, and your motivation is deep and sincere, and yet you don't understand things, right? Because you're not a member of this community. There's a communication scholar named Julia Wood who developed a theory called standpoint theory. And standpoint theory notes that privileged community members inevitably know less about marginalized communities than marginalized communities know about dominant mainstream history, terminology, and norms. In other words, a heterosexual cisgender person knows less about the LGBTQ+ communities than the LGBTQ+ community members know about what it means to act like or behave like a heterosexual cisgender person. This is because marginalized community members typically must adapt to dominant mainstream norms, or at least navigate them effectively. But privileged community members typically assume their social world is the same as everybody else's social world until the truth comes crashing in around them, right? It's only when privileged community members are compelled to see these things or actively investigate them that we realize that what we thought was everybody's world was just our world. This can sometimes be disheartening or even disturbing as you begin to realize that maybe you have participated in some of these behaviors and activities that continue to privilege certain voices over other voices. Maybe you've misunderstood things and replicated misunderstandings in ways that maintain, for example, heteronormativity and the perception that everybody is heterosexual. And maybe you realize, oh my goodness, I absolutely need to change and grow, and it's in a lot of different ways. So sometimes it can leave you feeling at a loss. When I was part of the team forming Rollins Safe Zone in 2007, I worked with the dean of the chapel at the time, Patrick Powers. There's a picture of Pat. He's left Rollins. We have a new dean, the Reverend Katrina Jenkins, who is wonderful. But it was wonderful that Pat Powers wanted to be part of Safe Zone, obviously, as the sort of chief religious voice on campus. It was great that he was there strongly in support of LGBTQ plus identities. As strong as he was in his support of these identities, he had a certain block. Early on in our training and our conversations with each other and our conversations with trainers and readings and so forth, Patrick kept running into the word queer. There's queer theory, there's queer pride, queer identity, gender queer, and most of us were throwing these words around, these phrases around easily, comfortably. We understood or felt we understood what they meant. We felt comfortable with them. But Pat Powers grew up in the late 50s and early 60s, and his experience of the word queer was exclusively as a playground taunt, a threat, a word that would be used just before someone was ready to fight you, a word used to degrade masculine identity. And he couldn't shake the associations he had with that word. He understood that there would be students on campus who would identify as genderqueer or who would express queer pride. He understood that the word queer could mean other things and that it had been reappropriated by the LGBTQ plus community to mean something different than he used it as. But it was still a word that was very hard for him to use because of his background. He couldn't accept queer as a positive, reappropriated term that had been taken from being used as a threat and an insult and been reappropriated as a source of pride for the community. He felt challenged to appreciate how our youth might identify as queer. This, of course, demonstrates how language, identity, and culture are just as fluid as sexuality and gender. Ultimately, one of the things we're learning over and over again about sexuality and gender is that these are not necessarily fixed identities and that they're not easily identifiable within a spectrum of possible options. And language, identity, and culture are the same. What does queer mean? What does gay mean? How do we use these terms? And how do the terms get used within the various communities we're talking about? This can sometimes lead to what I call spectrum overload when we talk about the full range of identities in the LGBTQ plus communities. A standard graphic that's used here is the gender unicorn, which notes that we have several different elements of our identity. There's our gender identity, whether we think of ourselves primarily as female or feminine, male or masculine, or some other sort of gender or gender combination. There's how we express our gender. That is how we perform that element of our identity in the way we dress and carry ourselves and talk and so forth. There's our sex that we were assigned at birth, including intersex as well as other. There's who we're physically attracted to, which can be women, men, or other, or both. And there's who we are emotionally attracted to, women, men, or other genders. And that's just scratching the tip of the iceberg here. In addition, there's terms like asexual and aromantic, or demisexual and demiromantic to describe folks who are whose sexual identity is less significant in their mindset than many of us would assume the sexual identity is, or the romantic identity is. There's pansexual, there's genderqueer, and when you become an advocate for the LGBTQ plus community, you keep running into new terms, new concepts, new identities, and having to start over again and go, oh wait, I thought I had this, I don't have it. Of course, the rest of the world will always be even further behind than you. This is perhaps most obvious in an era of Trump, right? But it's true in general. When Rollins College got its new president, Grant Cornwell, in 2015, he was talking with me about diversity and inclusion. And Grant said that diversity and inclusion work on a campus is hard work, in part because every 4 years we have to start all over again. He was, of course, referencing the turnover of students and the fact that every time we get a new generation of students in, we have to start at ground zero with them. We can't assume that society has moved on or figured out these issues. We have to go back to the ground level and ask, how do we promote diversity and inclusion and invite diversity and inclusion with these young people and with these young people. For me, one of the lessons of Trump's presidency is this: never assume that we have eradicated hate and fear. This work is never finished, right? So it's even a stronger version of the statement that Grant Cornwell said. It is hard work to do this kind of work because you have to keep doing it over and over again. As an ally, you are more aware of the issues than the people that you're trying to educate or transform. And you are also more aware of the hate and fear than are the people that you're addressing in most cases. They probably don't see these things. In short, allies often find friends, neighbors, and loved ones asking, why? Why do you do this? Why are these things important to you? And you're constantly having to sort of explain your identity, or opt not to explain your identity as an ally, and to explain your investment in supporting this community. Another thing to remember as an ally is that your experience is your experience. One misstep that allies engage in is equalizing experience. This is basically the belief that, well, we're all the same fundamentally. Now, of course, in some ways, humans are all the same fundamentally. But one way to ask yourself this is, if you are heterosexual and cisgender, how do you answer these questions? So if you're heterosexual and perform your your gender according to your biological sex norms, how do you answer these questions? Can you hold your partner's hand in public without thinking twice? Are you at risk of being fired over your gender identity or whom you love? Did you talk openly with your parents about your first crush? Did your childhood religion approve of your gender or sexual identity? Now, it's fairly rare for a member of the LGBTQ communities to be able to say yes to all these questions, right? That is just my way of trying to point to the fact that it's a different experience, that your experience is your experience, and their experience is their experience. Of course, you probably do have some things in common with any given member of the LGBTQ plus communities. You just shouldn't assume that, right? As an ally, your assumption should be, I want to know what your experience is. And I will share you what my experience is, but I'm not going to assume that we have similar backgrounds, values, interests, ways of thinking about what romance is, ways of thinking about what relationships are. You have your background and your experience, and I have my background and my experience. Finally, for all these reasons, I often encourage allies to take a moment every now and then to stay put, shut up, and listen. That is to say, Often allies are very active and promoting social justice, and this is a great and wonderful thing, and you should do it. But sometimes your voice can become the dominant voice in the conversation, to the exclusion in some cases of the marginalized voices that you're trying to speak for. Uh, Being an ally is about supporting and empowering those with less power, and allies sometimes privilege their own voices and desires over the voices and desires of marginalized communities. This is often well intentioned. Nonetheless, for allies, it is often best to say less, listen more, and seek out and find ways to promote marginalized voices. How can you make sure that those voices are heard, not necessarily that your voice is heard? This means often that you should look for ways in which this community, that can be a community of color if you're not a person of color, it can be an LGBTQ plus community if you're heterosexual and cisgender. Look for ways in which this community has invited you to take action and is seeking your support. What do the members of this community want you to do? And that often means creating an honest and authentic dialogue with members of this community, instead of just assuming that you know what the correct action is and how to pursue social justice in this particular case. All of which is my cue to shut up. uh, in summary, as an ally, I try to remember the following. I will always be behind the curve. I will always be learning. This is exciting for me as a scholar and as a teacher, but it does mean that at no point will I ever have what I might consider even vaguely to be mastery over these issues. The rest of the world will always be even further behind. I'll always have to be reaching out to people and communicating ideas that have become sort of common sense for me now, that are not common sense for others. My experience is my experience, and the experience of marginalized community members is theirs. And I have to authentically engage in a dialogue with these individuals and these communities to figure out how my experiences are similar and how they're different. And finally, like I said, sometimes it's best to just stay put, shut up, and listen. Uh, I have talked enough as an ally about how to be an ally, and I think I've used up all of my time. Now, I urge you to share your thoughts, responses, and concerns, and I'm more than willing to talk with you in this context about what you're thinking and feeling. Thank you very much.